Hello, thank you for watching another video for this April online PD session. And thank you also for your emails with your comments because your thoughts really help me when I make these videos. So today's lesson is, again, one of my most favorite lessons that I use with my students. And it is talking with our students to stop, think, consider, and reconsider what's going on in a story. And I talk with my students a great deal that this is what I do as a reader. If I just keep reading and reading and reading and I don't stop and think and consider what is taking place in the story that I'm reading or the informational text that I'm reading, and many times there are things that are illuminated as we read that help us to reconsider some of our prior thoughts. So today's lesson I'm going to use Because of Winn-Dixie, and I'm going to show you how I teach my students and model for them that real readers do pause. Real readers do stop, think, consider, and reconsider what is taking place in the story. So readers, as I read, I sometimes will get distracted and I just keep reading. And then when I get to a new chapter, I think to myself, what just occurred? And sometimes I'm not sure and I have to go back and I have to completely reread. This happens when I'm reading fiction and informational texts. So what I want to show you today, what I want to teach you is something that real readers do all the time, is we read and there are moments when we stop and we think about what has the author introduced to us? What has the author been telling us in the story? Have new characters come about? Have characters changed? Have characters said something that is contrary to what they were saying in the beginning of the book? Or do their actions change? Are they now contrary to what they were in the beginning of the book? Are characters developing? Do we learn a little bit more about the setting? Is the setting important? What are the events taking place? Are things happening that are leading to the climax, the highest point of the story? Are things being offered for us to think about the theme, the author's purpose? So as real readers, our most enjoyment will occur when we stop, think, consider, and reconsider when we're reading. So today I want to read a little bit from Because of Winn-Dixie. And we remember that we read the first chapter and we talked about thinking about the gist of our reading. What were the main things that happened? So now we're going to read on and see if any new information is being offered to us to develop this story. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie. You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all of my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park. And the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alford, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or with Mrs. Detweller's little yappy Yorkie dog. Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he is thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle, hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? So I'm going to stop and I'm going to think about what the author has put into this story. So we are getting to know the characters and the setting because it's the beginning of the story. It's the beginning of the story, and the plot is developing. So I'm thinking that what I already know about Opal is that she understands what her situation is, and she's already fallen in love with this dog. We've already seen that she's highly compassionate and very smart, because in the grocery store she somehow got the dog and named it Winn-Dixie real quickly, and now she's bringing the dog home. And so we learned about the preacher in the first chapter, and now we're learning that this is her daddy and that he is a very thoughtful person, and his main concern though really is preaching. So she says how she's exceptional, meaning that she's allowed to live in this trailer park community that's really only for adults because she's so good. Now, I am wondering, as I stop, think, and I'm considering what's going on here. And because the title is because of Winn-Dixie, that's another reason why I think what's about to happen is I believe the preacher has taught her to be kind and compassionate, and now she's asking, can she keep Winn-Dixie? And I think he is a little distracted with his preaching. So I am thinking and considering everything that we have learned, that the preacher is kind to, and he is going to let her keep this less fortunate animal. So now I need to read on and see if anything develops in the story that will make me reconsider. So we have Opal, who's very kind. We have the preacher, who's also kind but distracted. And Opal, the independent little girl with the kind heart, who's fallen in love with this dog who is behaving. I think he's going to get to stay. But let's read on. Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that the Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too. that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you've found one. So at this point, at the end of the chapter, I'm thinking to myself that I was correct. There's nothing that I have to reconsider at this point. The only part was when it said, she told him, I found a dog, and the preacher said, no dogs. We've talked about this before. We don't need a dog. At that moment, I did pause in my mind, and I was reconsidering what I was thinking. Well, maybe because they seem like very good people that follow rules. However, there is the exception. It's only adults in the trailer park, yet she's a little girl and she's allowed to live there with her father, who's the preacher. So I was reconsidering if I thought that possibly what was going to happen, and maybe the plot was going to be that she wasn't allowed to keep the dog, and that was where the story would go. So in that moment, I was reconsidering. But as I kept reading, I went with my original, what I had thought about, what I had considered, had stopped before, and the characters are following suit. They're following the pattern that Opal is kind and independent, and she seems to be very smart, very intuitive to the situation, and she set up the situation for the preacher to really consider keeping this dog, because she knows that he is all about helping the less fortunate, and she created the scenario of saying this really is a less fortunate dog. So then the preacher went along with what we've learned about him, that he's very kind, and he did think about what was going on. So now it looks like we have this dog, and the dog is also following very along the path of what we've learned about him. So now I'm at the point of when I stop and think and consider and reconsider, I'm thinking about, will the characters continue on this way? I wonder if we learned that the preacher is a little distracted, that he doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to Opal. So I am considering and thinking about, is this dog exactly what this little girl needs? This little girl needs someone to pay attention to her and someone for her to give a lot of attention to. And I'm wondering, will this dog possibly help the preacher to stop and maybe give Opal a little more attention? Because it said there, remember, it said that he was like a turtle who kept his head in the shell. However, the dog helped him to come out of the shell and really look at Winn-Dixie and say, yes, we're going to keep this dog. So this is, again, what I do as a reader. As I read, I stop, I think about what I'm reading, I consider the story elements that are there if I'm reading fictional, like I did with Because of Winn-Dixie, and there are moments that I might reconsider my thinking if new information is given. And by doing this stop, think, and reconsider, it keeps me close to the text. It helps me to really understand and comprehend what is taking place in the text. Thank you very much for watching the video, and take care.